Super Mario Sunshine is a video game that was released in 2002 and was the follow-up to the massively successful Super Mario 64, a title that for many people set the standard for 3D gaming. Upon its release, Sunshine received a warm enough reception, but by the time its successor Super Mario Galaxy was released in 2007, the critical narrative had begun to shift. Many of the reviews of Mario Galaxy cast Mario Sunshine in the role of the red-headed stepchild, with some going so far as to call Galaxy the spiritual successor, or even the true sequel to Mario 64. This reflects what seems to be a commonly held view that Mario Galaxy and Mario 64 have more in common with each other than either of them do with Mario Sunshine. This begs a few questions. What specific elements of these games are responsible for this reaction? How can we use these elements to make inferences about the creative processes behind each game? And the most important question, to me at least, is why is it that I like Sunshine a hell of a lot more than those other games? These questions can all be answered in terms of two concepts that I've talked about on this channel before: constraint and holism. Let's start with constraint. The most immediately obvious difference between these games is that Super Mario Sunshine takes place entirely on a tropical island named Isle Delfino, and this places a pretty severe constraint on the creator's options when designing environments. I've spoken before about how constraint incentivizes creative thinking, and often leads to more creative output. It presents creators with problems that can only be solved by flexing their creative muscles. In Sunshine's case, the problem is, how do we set an entire game in a tropical locale without just making the same beach level 8 times? The solution we ended up with is a collection of levels that includes all the things you'd expect: white, sandy beaches, busy ports, a volcano, but also some of the less obvious things, like hilly uplands, a mountain village with hot springs, and the very unique Noki Bay with its Pacific Island theme and ancient ruins. These kinds of levels could only really exist in a game where the developers challenged themselves to dig a little deeper into their subject matter in order to provide something a little more nuanced. Compared to any one of these levels, Mario Galaxy 2's idea of tropical comes across as bland and shallow. The Galaxy games don't have a similar level of constraint, so there's less incentive to be creative. When you're free to use any idea that comes to mind, you'll usually use the first idea that comes to mind. That means more sunken ships, more log cabins nestled in bland snowscapes, and more flat, featureless oceans of lava. I think the clearest example of this difference can be found in the haunted house levels, which have become a staple of the series. In Mario Sunshine, the developers faced a problem. How do we reconcile haunted house with tropical island? Their solution was to make a haunted, luxury beachfront hotel that even has a casino where you can fight King Boo on a giant roulette wheel by playing slots. If that ain't the spitting image of creative, I don't know what is. So, what can we expect from Mario Galaxy in this area? Mario's in space, so maybe we get a spooky, derelict spaceship or something. That would be cool. But what we get instead is the haunted house from Mario 64. Floating in space. You know, come to think of it, despite being called Mario Galaxy, there's a distinct lack of space theming in the game. And that's not even a bad thing necessarily, it's just, well, hold on, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. I want to back up a little bit and talk about holism. Holism basically means concerning the whole. It's often contrasted with its counterpart reductionism, which concerns the parts. A holistic work is one in which all the different elements coalesce into a bigger whole by contributing to a common goal. Super Mario Sunshine is a holistic game in that it seems like almost every creative decision was made in response to a single, overarching directive: to further establish Isle Delfino as a fully realized, living place. We can see the signs of this goal in almost every element of the game. Even the menus. To get to your shine totals, you first have to go to a map screen that shows the geographical relationships between all the levels. You can even select the levels, or these little pictures of the locals, to learn more about the island. And speaking of geography, isn't it neat how you can see some levels in the background of other levels? The game really seems to want you to understand the layout of the island. The music in each level is also really distinctive and reinforces the unique flavor of each area. Steel drums for the laid-back Gelato Beach, electric guitar and gritty horns in the industrial Rico Harbor, pan flutes in Noki Bay. If you placed any of these tracks in a different level, they'd feel out of place, and that's something you can't really say for a lot of the tracks in Galaxy or 64. Even the gameplay. FLUDD as a platforming tool extends Mario's vertical and horizontal reach, meaning the levels can be more spread out and less cluttered, which helps the developer's ability to build the kind of larger, open-world levels that the setting demands. If you want to get to the top of this lighthouse, you can just use the rocket nozzle. The level designers didn't have to put a building nearby that you can wall jump off of, which would have compromised the lighthouse's ability to stick out as a landmark. The blue coins provide incentive for players to explore all corners of these large levels, and to learn the spatial relationships of their various features. The large number of NPCs also helps make Delfino feel like an inhabited, living place, and notice how instead of just getting from point A to point B, a lot of the shines involve Mario solving problems faced by the island inhabitants, and the effects carry over across missions. After chasing Shadow Mario out of each level, the player is rewarded with a final mission that gives a glimpse of what normal life is like in each of these zones. But why is this important? Why put so much effort into establishing Isle Delfino? This is a Mario game, right? Isn't Mario supposed to be the star attraction? And what about gameplay? This is a video game. Isn't gameplay the most important thing? Well, I would argue that all of the effort into building up Isle Delfino actually enhances the core Mario gameplay. I don't know, to me, a big part of the appeal of video games is the power fantasy element. Mario does extraordinary things, and it feels cool as the player to be the one making him do these things. And there's a skill gradient too. The better you get at the game, the more powerful Mario appears. He does more elaborate acrobatics, and he combines them fluidly. This, by extension, makes the player feel more powerful. The great thing about Isle Delfino is that Mario's power is largely based on his ability to navigate an environment. The more defined and meaningful the environment, the more defined Mario's actions are, especially in a setting that's somewhat familiar to players. I have an idea of how cool it is to wall kick between buildings, run along rooftops, and belly flop onto the ground, and ride the wet pavement like a slip and slide. It feels really cool to make Mario do that. Isle Delfino in that sense serves as a frame of reference that allows us to gauge Mario's power, and to feel powerful ourselves. The problem with the Galaxy stages and some of the 64 stages is they're missing that frame of reference. How cool is it to, I don't know, walk on a giant caterpillar across some giant apples that are somehow floating in space? What about hopping across giant space popsicles? What's this wall a part of? Is it just chilling there? If Mario's surroundings are meaningless, how can his actions have any meaning? I mentioned before that Mario Galaxy has a lack of space theming, but that's not what separates it from Sunshine. Rather, it's the fact that Mario Galaxy doesn't seem to have any kind of unifying goal or idea. Some might say that the microgravity mechanics fit the bill, but I don't think they do. Not compared to games like Portal, where the entire game is built around a single mechanic. Each level adds to the Portal concept and utilizes it in new ways. Once the game is out of new ideas, it ends. And Mario Galaxy, after the first couple stars, you've basically seen everything the gravity system has to offer. The new ideas that are introduced later are just kind of their own individual things, turning into a boo or a spring. They don't interact with the gravity mechanics in any meaningful way. The spin drill from Galaxy 2 actually does bring something to the table, but that's the only one. This pattern extends beyond gameplay too. All of the components of the Galaxy games feel detached from each other. For example, let's take a look at the rolling masterpiece Galaxy from Galaxy 2. You're running on top of this ball across the level, trying to get the ball in a hole at the end. The visuals have an art store kind of theme, but is there any particular reason for this? If we reskinned the level to have any other kind of visual theme, would the level be any different? Art supplies already have nothing to do with a rolling ball, so theoretically you could substitute anything else and it would make at least as much sense. At least in the Galaxy 1 counterpart, the Rolling Green Galaxy, there's a golf course theme going on. Roll a ball in a hole, golf, it fits. You feel like the gameplay and art departments talked to each other on that one, or at the very least took cues from one another, but that's the exception. So many of the levels in the Galaxy games feel like they were made assembly line style. One guy designs an obstacle course, passes it on to the art department who slaps some textures on it, passes it on to the next guy who puts some music over it, but there's no real sense of cooperation toward a common goal. The elements are, for the most part, sorted into neat little bins that don't interact with each other. I think this goes a long way toward explaining Galaxy's critical reception. For a long time, video games were largely reviewed using a report card system, where each element is judged individually, and the final score is usually an average of the individual scores. The different components of the Galaxy games are already pre-sorted, which makes this kind of analysis convenient. But more than that, the lack of interaction means that each component sticks out like a sore thumb. When you're running along a conveyor belt made of taffy and utensils are floating in the background for no reason, the game is getting right up in your face and saying, "Hey, you see this? There's some art direction right here." When you're floating along with nothing to do for 5 seconds but listen to the music, the game is asking, "What do you think of this music, eh? Pretty good? I know Gusty Gardens is your favorite." As for gameplay, gee, I wonder how I'm supposed to get up here. Looking at it all like this, it seems to explain why you always seem to hear people talk about Mario Sunshine in basic terms like fun or boring. But when Mario Galaxy is broached, suddenly everyone is an expert on art design and game design. But you know, I've heard it said about film that if a shot is so elaborate that it makes the audience think, "Wow, what a great shot," then it has actually failed because the audience is thinking more about the shot than the things it's supposed to be depicting. Games critics have historically suffered lots of unfavorable comparisons to film critics, and many outlets have accordingly adjusted their review formats over the last few years, replacing their report card with a single score. Taking the report card out of the review is the easy part, however. Taking the reductionist report card mentality out of the reviewer is another matter altogether. So, the bottom line. Holism, at least to me, gives creative works real staying power. If a work devotes itself entirely to communicating an idea, then that idea tends to stick with you. I had some fun with the Galaxy games when they were first released, but I have no desire to return to them, or to Super Mario 64 for that matter. But at least once a year, when the days start getting warmer, I find myself wanting to revisit Isle Delfino. And no matter how many times I make the return trip, it never gets old.